Curiosity lingered in the cold that evening, drifting like a ghost through the falling snow over Silver Creek. The lamps in town flickered, but no one dared step outside. The blizzard had swallowed the road, the sky, even the sound of the river that usually hummed beneath the bridge. It was there, through that silent white world, that a young woman stumbled, her boots thin, her breath ragged, her dress torn where the wind had clawed it. She looked barely 26, though her eyes carried winters older than her years. Her name was Clara Wynne, but the world hadn't spoken it kindly in a long time. She had walked for days, driven by something she couldn't quite name, perhaps hope, perhaps just exhaustion. Every step felt borrowed, her legs trembling under the weight of hunger and cold. When she finally reached the edge of town, she paused before a single cabin standing apart from the others, smoke rising faintly from its chimney. A warm light flickered within. She hesitated, gripping her shawl tighter. Towns were dangerous for women like her. Too many eyes, too many judgments sharpened into words. But she was tired, bone-tired, the kind of weariness that made the soul ache more than the body. The door loomed before her like a final test. She knocked, faintly at first, then again, weaker still. The sound was barely a whisper over the storm. Inside, Jonas Hale set down his knife, the one he'd been using to carve a piece of oak into something shapeless. He wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever came this far up the ridge. The man lived alone for reasons the town liked to imagine but never truly knew. They said he'd once been a soldier. Some said he'd lost someone. Others said he'd simply grown tired of people. But none could say they'd ever seen him cruel. He opened the door cautiously, and in the threshold stood the woman, half-frozen, eyes dazed, trembling as though her body might fall apart if she spoke too quickly. "I'm tired," she whispered, her voice thin as smoke. "I can't walk anymore. Can I stay? Just one night?" Jonas studied her without a word. The snow was piling at her feet, and the wind pressed against her back as though urging her inside. He could see the frost forming on her lashes, the bruised color of her fingers. He didn't ask questions. He simply stepped aside. "Come in," he said quietly. The warmth inside struck her like mercy. She blinked, tears forming before she could stop them, the heat biting at her frozen skin. Jonas helped her sit by the fire, fetched a blanket, and ladled stew into a wooden bowl. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he feared startling her. When she tried to speak, her lips trembled too hard to form words. So he said nothing more. He just watched her eat, her hands shaking with each spoonful, her eyes darting now and then toward the door, expecting perhaps that kindness came with a cost. The snow beat against the windows, and time slowed. Jonas sat back in his chair, his face lit by the fire's glow, handsome in a rugged, unbothered way, the sort of beauty that comes from a life of quiet endurance. "You can sleep there," he said, nodding toward the cot near the fire. "There's no lock on the door. You can leave when you need." She looked at him, searching his expression for the trap that never came. "Thank you," she managed. "I'll be gone by morning." He nodded once, his eyes unreadable. Outside, the wind howled like an old grief that neither of them spoke aloud. Morning came silver and soft. Clara woke to the smell of coffee, her body stiff but alive. The cabin was modest, just wood, tools, and the faint scent of pine, but it was warm. She folded the blanket neatly, out of habit more than gratitude, and stood in the doorway. Jonas was at the fence, fixing a loose rail, his breath rising in small clouds. She thought to leave then, to disappear before the world remembered her. But her legs wouldn't move. Maybe it was the stillness, or the sound of his axe splitting wood like a steady heartbeat. Something in it felt safe, or at least, safer than anything she'd known. By noon, whispers had begun in town. The general store owner saw smoke from Jonas's cabin and told the blacksmith's wife. By evening, everyone knew. The mountain man had taken in a woman. Some said he'd gone mad, others that she was trouble. A preacher's wife even claimed she was a thief who'd been seen near the stagecoach station months ago. In Silver Creek, stories didn't need truth to survive, they only needed voices. That night, Clara tried to leave. She gathered her things, such as they were, a torn shawl, a locket with no picture, and moved toward the door. But Jonas, still awake by the fire, looked up. "It's late," he said simply. "They'll talk," she whispered, eyes down. "You don't owe me shelter." Jonas set down the carving in his hands. "I don't much care for their talk." His voice was calm, not unkind, but firm enough to make her pause. "You're welcome to rest here till you can stand strong again." She wanted to argue, to tell him she was used to leaving before being left. But his eyes held no pity, only quiet understanding. She nodded, and the door stayed closed. Days passed. The storm eased, though snow still clung to the hills. Clara began to move with more strength, helping where she could, mending a shirt, sweeping the porch, feeding his horse. Jonas never asked her name again. He already knew enough. She noticed how careful he was, how his silences weren't heavy but deliberate, as if he measured every word before giving it. Sometimes she caught him watching her not with desire, but with recognition, the look of someone who understood what it meant to be worn down by the world. When she laughed one morning, an unplanned, startled laugh at the stubborn rooster that chased her from the yard, Jonas turned from his work and smiled faintly, the kind of smile that made her forget for a moment that she was broken. But Silver Creek did not forgive easily. One evening, the preacher's wife rode up the ridge, her coat buttoned tight, her eyes like flint. "Mr. Hale," she called out, "you're harboring a woman under your roof, and folks are talking. It's not decent." Jonas looked at her, then at Clara, who stood in the doorway, pale but steady. "She's under my roof because the cold would have killed her otherwise," he said. "If that's indecent, then I reckon I'll live indecent." The woman pursed her lips, turned her horse, and rode away without a word. As darkness fell, Clara sat near the fire, her hands clasped tight. "They'll never stop," she said softly. Jonas leaned against the window, watching the snow. "Then let them wear their tongues thin," he murmured. She looked at him, something fragile flickering in her eyes. "Why do you care?" He turned to her, his voice low but certain. "Because once, someone cared when they shouldn't have. I'd be dead if they hadn't." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, warm and patient. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "Then maybe it's my turn to stay." Outside, the storm quieted, and for the first time in years, peace settled over Silver Creek, unnoticed, uncelebrated, but real enough to last the night. Dawn broke with a quiet grace, soft light spilling through the frosted windows of Jonas Hale's cabin. The snow had thinned during the night, leaving behind a world washed clean, though the cold still bit at the edges of every breath. Clara stirred beneath her blanket, half waking to the smell of wood smoke and coffee. The crackle of the fire comforted her, but unease pressed faintly against her chest. Each day here felt like something borrowed, something that might be taken back once the world remembered her. She'd spent her life leaving before she could be left behind. Yet every morning, she found herself still here, and every morning, Jonas was still there too, quiet, steady, unchanging as the mountains that cradled his home. Outside, the land was waking from winter's grip. Icicles broke free from the eaves, and the creek near the ridge whispered beneath thin ice. Jonas worked in silence, mending a fence rail that the storm had snapped. Clara stood in the doorway, watching him, sunlight turning her hair gold where it touched. There was something in the rhythm of his movements, a certainty she envied. He never seemed haunted by what others thought or by what the past demanded. She longed to know what that kind of peace felt like. She stepped outside, boots crunching over the snow. "You don't rest much," she said, her voice carrying gently through the still air. Jonas looked up, squinting at her through the morning light. "Things fall apart easy out here," he said. "Best to keep ahead of it." Clara smiled faintly. "I know that feeling." He gave her a small nod, the corner of his mouth twitching as if he understood more than he said. It wasn't the words between them that mattered, it was the silences that grew comfortable, the small gestures that softened the days. She'd begun to hum while she worked, and he'd begun to listen, though he never admitted it. But peace, she had learned, never stayed long where gossip had taken root. When Jonas rode into town that afternoon for supplies, the air there felt heavier than usual. Conversations hushed when he entered the store. Men leaned against barrels, eyes narrow with judgment. A few women turned their backs. He ignored them, as he always did, buying flour and coffee, nails for the fence, feed for the horse. But when he turned to leave, the preacher's wife blocked his path. "Mr. Hale," she said coldly, "you've set a poor example for our town. Keeping that woman up there. Folks are beginning to talk." Jonas met her gaze, his voice level. "Let them." Her lips tightened. "You can't hide sin behind snow and solitude forever. It'll find you." He said nothing, only brushed past her and stepped into the pale afternoon. He'd never cared much for talk, but this time something inside him twisted, not in anger but in quiet resolve. By evening, a storm of a different kind gathered outside his cabin. Clara was washing the tin dishes when she heard the distant murmur of voices, the crunch of many boots in the snow. She glanced out the window and froze. Lanterns flickered in the dark, dozens of them. The townsfolk were coming up the ridge. Fear clenched in her throat. "Jonas," she whispered. "They're here." He moved to the window, his expression unreadable. The crowd grew clearer now, faces hard with suspicion, torches trembling in the wind. At their front stood the preacher's wife, her shawl drawn tight, eyes gleaming with self-righteous certainty. Jonas stepped outside before she could speak, his breath fogging in the cold. "You come all this way to start a fire?" he asked quietly. "We've come for decency," she replied. "She's brought shame to this place. You've brought shame to yourself. Send her away." Clara stood behind him, trembling but defiant. Her voice, though soft, carried in the night. "I stole nothing from you. I took no man's coin, no man's name. I only asked for warmth when I was freezing." The preacher's wife sneered. "You took more than that. You took pity you didn't deserve." Jonas's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, the torchlight glinting off the scar that ran faintly along his temple. "You think mercy's something a person has to deserve," he said. "You think kindness is a sin?" No one answered. The wind howled through the trees, lifting snow into the firelight. Jonas looked at each of them in turn. "You all talk about decency like it's something that can be taken or given. But decency's just doing right when no one's watching." She asked for shelter. "I gave it. That's all there is." The preacher's wife opened her mouth but closed it again, the force of his calm making her words small. One by one, the torches lowered. The crowd, suddenly unsure of itself, began to scatter. Snow muffled their retreat until only silence remained. When Jonas turned, Clara was still standing there, eyes wet, her hands pressed to her chest. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You've given me everything. You could have turned me away." He took a breath, his tone steady. "I don't have much in this world, Clara. A roof, a fire, a bit of peace. But if I can't use those to make something right, then they're not worth having." The words struck something deep within her, a place that had long believed she was unworthy of being seen as human. Slowly, she stepped toward him, her hands trembling. "You should know," she whispered. "I've never stayed anywhere longer than I had to." Jonas met her eyes, the faintest warmth in his smile. "Then maybe it's time you stayed because you want to." The wind softened. The moon rose over the ridge, scattering silver across the snow. Inside, the fire crackled, steady as a heartbeat. Clara sat near it, pulling her shawl close, though she was no longer cold. She watched Jonas move about the cabin, setting things in order, quiet as always. Something in her chest loosened, an ache replaced by peace. Days passed, and the snow began to melt. The world outside the cabin turned from white to gold, the earth breathing again beneath thawing streams. The townsfolk, in their way, grew quieter. Some offered nods when Jonas passed, others left food at the edge of his land. None spoke of that night again. One morning, as the sun rose pink over the mountains, Jonas stepped outside to find Clara sitting on the bench he'd built beside the fence. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair loose in the wind, her eyes bright with something he hadn't seen before, contentment. "You plan on running today?" he asked, teasing softly. She shook her head, smiling. "No." I think I've done enough running for one lifetime. He joined her on the bench, the quiet between them warm and full. The land stretched wide and alive around them, the creek whispering through the thaw. For the first time, neither felt like a visitor in their own lives. When Clara reached for his hand, Jonas didn't pull away. Their fingers laced together naturally, as if the space between them had always been waiting to close. She turned to him, voice low. "You gave me a night of shelter," she said, "and I found forever in it." Jonas looked out at the horizon where sunlight touched the snow one last time before spring. "Guess that's the way of things," he murmured. "Sometimes, forever starts quiet." The wind carried their laughter down the valley, a soft, steady sound, two hearts finally at rest beneath the wide, forgiving sky.